Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through the complete history of the 9 divines, the gods who shaped Tamriel long before it had a name. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and whether you already know all 9 of their stories, because some of these connections might surprise you. Before the first mortal drew breath, there was only the dance of 2 forces. Anu, the beginning, stillness and permanence, and Padme, change, motion and conflict. From their mingling came the blood that formed the Aedra, the gods who chose to pour themselves into the making of the world, unlike the Daedra, who traced their origins to Padme alone and largely stayed apart from the mortal plane. The Aedra sacrificed pieces of their own eternal power to shape Nirn, and in doing so, became bound to it in ways that echo through every game in this series, in Morrowind's ancestor shrines, in Oblivion's shattered chapels, in the wayside statues you've walked past 100 times in Skyrim without a second glance. Among these Aedra, 9 would eventually be gathered together under a single banner, worshipped as one pantheon by an empire that would come to span nearly the entire continent, from a deified emperor whose name alone still sparks war, to a quiet goddess of love whose priest may have married you in Riften without you ever learning her deeper story. Tonight we walk through each of them, one by one, tracing their myths from the oldest surviving texts to the shrines you can still find standing today. We begin, as any history of the 9 must, with the one who came first. The Grace of Akatosh. Akatosh is called many things across many cultures. To the Nords he becomes tangled, sometimes uncomfortably, with Alduin. To the Altmer and the other Mer races, he is Ari-El, ancestor and king. To the dragons themselves, if the old texts are believed, he is Bormahu, our father. But in the imperial pantheon of Cyrodiil, he is Akatosh, the dragon god of time, and he stands as the undisputed head of the 9 divines. According to the oldest creation myths, Akatosh was the first spirit to fully crystallize out of the primordial mingling of Anu and Padme. His arrival made it easier for the other gods to take shape, as though his very existence taught the universe how solidity worked. This single detail carries enormous weight. Akatosh isn't simply the most powerful or the most worshipped of the 9. He is, in a structural sense, the reason the others could exist at all. Time itself, as a concept mortals can perceive and measure, is said to flow from him. Without Akatosh, some scholars argue, there would be no sequence of events, no cause and effect, no story to tell at all. Only the eternal stillness of Anu, or the eternal chaos of Padme, locked in permanent struggle. This connects directly to one of the most consequential events in all of Tamrielic history. The binding of Akatosh's power into the Amulet of Kings, and the dragonfires beneath the imperial city's white gold tower. When Sinalesia led the mortal slave rebellion against the Aelids in the First Era, Akatosh appeared to her, granting her an amulet infused with a portion of his divine essence. This amulet became a symbol of legitimate rule, and every emperor of Cyrodiil after Alesia was expected to wear it and, crucially, to keep the dragonfires lit. The dragonfires functioned as a kind of standing ward, a barrier that kept the realms of Oblivion at bay and prevented the Daedric princes from freely invading Nirn. This is why the assassination of Emperor Uriel Septim VII and the extinguishing of the dragonfires in the events of Oblivion mattered so profoundly. Mehrunes Dagon's forces poured through Oblivion gates across Cyrodiil because the barrier Akatosh's power maintained had been broken. If you've stood atop the great chapel of Akatosh in the Imperial City, or descended into the Temple District's Dragonfire's chamber during that quest line, you were standing inside the literal architecture of Akatosh's protective covenant with mankind, a covenant thousands of years old, made tangible in stone and flame. Akatosh's role as head of the Pantheon isn't just ceremonial. Nearly every major religious structure across Cyrodiil acknowledges him first, even in cities whose great chapels are formally dedicated to a different divine. Each of Cyrodiil's 8 parish cities maintains its own great chapel to its own patron. Corals belongs to Stendarr, Bruma's to Talos, Skingrad's to Julianos, and so on. But every one of those buildings still holds an altar to Akatosh, alongside the rest of the 9, and his true seat of central worship, the Temple of the One in the Imperial City itself, sits at the literal heart of the Empire's capital, the closest thing Cyrodiil has to a single unifying cathedral. Priests of Akatosh often hold the highest rank within the broader imperial cult hierarchy, regardless of which city they're posted in. His way shrines, scattered through the wilderness of Cyrodiil, were the first stop for any pilgrim attempting the pilgrimage of the 9, the ritual undertaken during the Knights of the 9 quest line, where the player travels to each of the 9 way shrines in turn to prove their worthiness before receiving the blessing needed to face Umaril the Unfeathered. It's worth pausing on that structure, because it reveals something about how the game itself, mechanically and narratively, treats Akatosh as the anchor point of the entire Pantheon. You cannot skip him. Every pilgrimage begins in spirit, if not always in literal travel order, with an acknowledgement of the dragon god of time. The complicated relationship between Akatosh and Alduin deserves careful unpacking, because it's one of the richest threads connecting Oblivion's lore to the events of Skyrim. Alduin, the antagonist you spend the entirety of Skyrim's main questline hunting, is understood by the Nords as the World Eater, a primordial force tied to the actual destruction and renewal of the world at the end of time. According to certain Nordic prophetic texts, he claimed, according to several in-game sources, to be the firstborn of Akatosh, and for a long stretch of Nordic history, he ruled over the early Nords as a tyrant god-king, demanding worship and blood sacrifice. When the Empire absorbed Skyrim and brought the worship of Akatosh northward, the Nords understandably conflated the two figures, since both were draconic and both claimed a form of primacy over time and fate. Imperial scholars, including a Bishop of Akatosh in the Second Era, described this conflation as a brutal misunderstanding that the cult of Akatosh had failed to fully correct even centuries later. By the time you're hearing greybeards and priests in Skyrim discuss Alduin, there's still genuine theological confusion baked into the world about whether he superficially resembles Akatosh, as one Third Era scholar put it, or whether the two are meaningfully the same, being wearing different masks for different cultures. The game never resolves this cleanly, and that ambiguity is intentional. It reflects the way real religious syncretism works, messy, contested, and never fully settled even among the faithful. Akatosh's symbolism recurs constantly throughout Skyrim's main story in ways that are easy to walk past without noticing the deeper thread. The Blades, the ancient order of dragon hunters and emperor's bodyguards you encounter through Delphine and Esbern, trace their founding back to reverence for Akatosh, specifically as the dragon god, separate from and often in tension with the more monstrous dragon worship of Alduin's original followers. Their entire purpose, hunting dragons, exists in a strange dual relationship with Akatosh's own draconic nature. They serve the dragon god by opposing dragons who would set themselves up as tyrants in the mode of Alduin, which tells you something important about how Tamrielic religion often works. Worship of a god doesn't mean uncritical reverence toward everything associated with that god's symbolism. It means aligning with what that god is understood to represent, in this case, the ordered flow of time and history, against those who would seize power and freeze the world in tyranny. The blessing of Akatosh, found at shrines throughout both Cyrodiil and Skyrim, is tied to magica regeneration, a fittingly appropriate gift from the god whose essence underlies the passage of time itself, since magica recovery is fundamentally a process that happens as time passes. It's a small mechanical detail, but it reflects a broader pattern in Elder Scrolls religious design. The blessings granted by each of the 9 divines are never arbitrary. They're extensions of that god's core sphere of influence, made playable. When you kneel at a shrine of Akatosh, in the Temple of the Divines in Solitude, or at one of the many wilderness shrines scattered across Skyrim's holds, you're participating in a devotional tradition stretching back to the earliest recorded Cyrodiilic religious text, the 10 Commands, in which Akatosh's own command to the faithful reads simply, "Serve and obey your emperor, study the covenants, worship the 9, do your duty, and heed the commands of the saints and priests." It's a command about order, hierarchy, and continuity, values that make perfect sense coming from the god whose very existence made an ordered, sequential universe possible in the first place. Even his absence carries weight. When the dragonfires go dark, when the bloodline of Alessia that could carry the amulet's blessing seems extinguished, the stability Akatosh represents cracks, and oblivion itself comes pouring through. Whatever else the 9 divines represent to the people of Tamriel, Akatosh is the one whose protection, when withdrawn, nearly ends the world. There's a further layer worth exploring here, one that connects Akatosh's mythology directly to the very abilities your character wields throughout Skyrim. The power of the Thu'um, the voice, the ability to shout with the force of a dragon, is understood in Nordic tradition as a gift tied to the draconic bloodline Akatosh represents, whether filtered through his more benevolent aspect or through the more tyrannical shadow cast by Alduin. Every time you absorb a dragon's soul atop a windswept barrow, you're participating, whether the game states it explicitly or not, in a power struggle that traces back to the same primal draconic essence Akatosh embodies. The Greybeards themselves, the ancient monks who've secluded themselves atop the throat of the world for centuries, frame their entire philosophy, the way of the voice, as a discipline meant to bring a mortal into harmony with that draconic inheritance rather than let it consume them, the way it consumed Alduin's original followers. This is, in a sense, Akatosh's own theology playing out in miniature. The difference between wielding immense, time-bending power responsibly in service of order and continuity, versus seizing it for domination the way the World Eater did. It's also worth noting how differently the cult of Akatosh operated across the eras when compared to the more folk-level shrine worship most players encounter in Skyrim. In Cyrodiil, particularly around the Imperial City, formal worship of Akatosh involved a hierarchy of bishops and chantry officials whose theological debates about Alduin, about the proper interpretation of the Alessian covenants, about how strictly the 10 Commands should be enforced among the laity, shaped imperial religious policy for centuries. This bureaucratic institutional side of Akatosh's worship rarely appears directly in Skyrim's gameplay, but its fingerprints are everywhere in the background lore. The very fact that Skyrim's Jarls, even those most resistant to imperial rule, still maintain shrines to Akatosh in their cities, speaks to just how deeply the formal architecture of his cult became embedded in the governance of the provinces the Empire absorbed. Even Ulfric Stormcloak, fighting to free Skyrim from what he sees as imperial overreach, has never once been shown rejecting Akatosh himself. Only the political structures built up around his worship. That distinction between the god and the empire that claims to serve him runs quietly beneath nearly every conversation about religion you'll have in Skyrim, and Akatosh sits at the center of it as the one figure both sides of the civil war still agree deserves reverence. Consider too the sheer geographic reach of his worship compared to any other single divine. Way shrines and chapels dedicated to Akatosh appear not only across Cyrodiil and Skyrim, but throughout the broader history of the Second Era as well, when the Three Banners War pitted rival alliances against one another across the whole of Tamriel. And yet, even amid that fractured, three-sided conflict, reverence for the Dragon of Time persisted on every side of the battlefield. This kind of near-universal endurance sets Akatosh apart, even from divines like Mara or Kynareth, whose worship, while nearly as widespread, still carries distinctly regional flavors and cultural reinterpretations depending on where you travel. Akatosh, by contrast, seems to resist being fully reshaped by any single culture's lens, remaining recognizably himself, the eternal, foundational dragon god. Whether you're kneeling at a modest way shrine in the Great Forest, or standing before the towering statue that once dominated the White Gold Tower before Alduin's return, forced the Empire to reckon, once again, with just how thin the boundary between order and catastrophe can become when a god's covenant is broken. The single most direct intervention of Akatosh into mortal affairs anywhere in the games occurs at the climax of the Oblivion Crisis, when Martin Septim, the last surviving heir of the Septim bloodline, faces Mehrunes Dagon at the ruined Temple of the One in the Imperial City. With the amulet of King shattered and no way left to reseal the barrier between Nirn and Oblivion through conventional means, Martin makes the choice to use the broken amulet's remaining power to transform himself, becoming a colossal avatar of Akatosh, a living dragon of fire and divine light, and in that form he battles Dagon directly before turning to stone, sacrificing his mortal life entirely to save Tamriel. This moment is worth dwelling on because it's one of the only times in the entire series where a divine's power doesn't simply bless or protect from a distance, but manifests bodily on Nirn to physically intervene in a battle between gods. It also closes the Septim bloodline forever, meaning the very covenant Akatosh made with Alessia's descendants ends not in failure, but in a final, total act of fulfillment, the last heir giving everything he has rather than let the barrier fail. Every subsequent ruler of the Empire, including the Mede dynasty that governs Tamriel by the time of Skyrim, rules without that direct bloodline connection to Akatosh's original covenant, a quiet but significant shift in the Empire's spiritual foundation that the games rarely state outright, but that shapes the entire political backdrop of the Fourth Era. The Vigil of Arkay. If Akatosh governs the grand sweep of time, Arkay governs its most intimate and universal expression, the cycle each mortal life must travel, birth to death, and, in the proper order of things, no further. Arkay is the god of the cycle of birth and death, sometimes called the Lord of the Wheel of Life, the Bringer of Light, or Lord of the Seasons, since his domain extends to the turning of the year as well as the turning of a single mortal existence. One of the oldest surviving myths about his origin, recorded in the text known as Arkay the God, tells a story unlike that of any other divine. Rather than being an eternal, uncreated force like Akatosh, Arkay is said to have begun as an ordinary mortal shopkeeper with an obsessive passion for knowledge. He discovered a book written in a language he could barely decipher, and he poured years of his life into understanding it, neglecting his business, his friendships, and eventually his own health, as a plague swept through his town. Dying, he prayed to Mara, the mother goddess, for more time to finish his study. Mara offered him a choice: die as he was, or become a god for eternity, tasked with maintaining the balance between life and death across the universe. He chose godhood, and in doing so became, according to this legend, the god sometimes called the mortal's god, because unlike most of the Aedra, he is said to have once walked among mortals as one of them. This origin story matters enormously for understanding why Arkay's priesthood behaves the way it does throughout the games. Because Arkay himself is said to have been mortal, his followers see him as uniquely positioned to understand the sanctity of the natural cycle mortals are bound to. His priesthood, the Order of Arkay, sometimes called the Temple of Arkay, positions itself as the fiercest and most uncompromising opponent of necromancy in all of Tamriel. Arkay's law holds that any body properly buried through his rites is protected from being raised as undead, which makes his priests natural enemies of necromancers, who view proper burial rites as an obstacle to their dark craft. This isn't abstract theology. It shows up constantly in the physical world of the games. In Skyrim, you can find the Hall of the Dead beneath nearly every major city, catacombs maintained by priests of Arkay who guard the honored dead against desecration. In Windhelm, in Whiterun, in Markarth, these halls of the dead exist as tangible expressions of Arkay's doctrine, sites where his priests stand watch, sometimes quite literally, against the encroachment of necromancy. The Markarth branch of this conflict deserves specific attention because it dramatizes Arkay's theology in a way few other locations manage. The Hall of the Dead in Markarth becomes the site of corruption by the followers of Namira, the Daedric prince associated with decay, filth, and the eating of the dead. The priest stationed there, Verulus, is a man of genuine but fragile faith, and the quest built around this location, sometimes called the Taste of Death, forces you to choose whether to side with the cult that has infiltrated Arkay's own sacred ground, or to cleanse it in his name. What makes this so thematically potent is that it inverts Arkay's entire purpose. His domain is the honoring and protection of the dead as part of a sacred, unbroken cycle. Namira's cult, by contrast, treats the dead as meat, a total violation of everything the Order of Arkay exists to prevent. Whichever choice you make in that quest, you're engaging directly with the tension between Arkay's vision of death as sacred transition and the perversions that his priesthood was founded specifically to resist. Arkay's presence in Oblivion takes a more structural, questline-oriented form through the Knights of the Nine content. The Sword of the Crusader, one of the relics of Pelinal Whitestrake, needed to face Umaril the Unfeathered, must be reconsecrated specifically in the Chapel of Arkay in Cheydinhal, since the blade had fallen into a cursed state and needed the god of death and rebirth's own sanctified ground to be restored to its proper purpose. There's a certain elegant symmetry here. A weapon corrupted into something resembling undeath, or at least unnatural persistence beyond its intended state, can only be redeemed through the intervention of the god whose entire portfolio concerns the proper, sanctified transition between states of being. This is the kind of connective tissue that runs quietly beneath so much of Elder Scrolls' religious lore. The relationship between a divine sphere and the mechanical requirements of a quest is rarely coincidental once you start looking closely. Arkay's association with the seasons connects his mythology to something even older and more agrarian than the imperial cult itself. Before Cyrodiilic worship formalized around the Nine, various Nordic and Colovian traditions already held reverence for cyclical seasonal renewal, and Arkay's absorption of this role allowed the newly formed pantheon under Alessia to accommodate beliefs that predated the Empire by centuries. This is part of a broader pattern worth noting throughout this whole video. The 9 divines as a formal pantheon were assembled, not simply inherited. When Alessia founded the First Empire, after her rebellion against the Aelids, she had to reconcile 2 very different religious traditions. The Aldmeri-influenced faith her people had adopted under Aelid captivity, and the Nordic pantheon of the armies from Skyrim, who had helped her win the war. Arkay's flexibility, his capacity to be both a god important in cultures where Akatosh's time-based aspects are difficult to grasp, and a god whose seasonal associations mapped cleanly onto older pre-imperial beliefs, made him one of the more successfully unifying figures in that delicate religious compromise. His blessing, granted at shrines throughout the games, typically restores health and cures disease, an appropriately literal gift from the god who governs the boundary between sickness, death, and renewal. But perhaps the most quietly moving detail about Arkay's worship is how it manifests not in grand theological debate, but in small, human moments. When you encounter a funeral procession in a Skyrim city, when a priest of Arkay speaks the rites over a fallen NPC, when you walk past a Hall of the Dead and see the neat rows of the honored departed, you're witnessing the ordinary, everyday practice of a faith whose central promise is simple and universal: that death, handled properly, with respect and ritual, is not an ending to be feared, but a transition to be honored. In a world constantly under threat from necromancers, vampires, and Daedric princes who would corrupt or weaponize the dead, Arkay's priesthood stands as one of the few constant lines of defense. Unglamorous, rarely glorified in songs the way Talos or Akatosh might be, but absolutely essential to the spiritual architecture of Tamriel. The tension between Arkay's doctrine and the reality of undead threats scattered throughout Skyrim deserves a closer look, because it's one of the more consistent through lines connecting his worship to the actual dungeons and encounters you experience while exploring the province. Draugr, the ancient Nordic warriors reanimated within their own burial barrows, present a particularly thorny theological problem within Arkay's framework. Unlike vampires or the reanimated corpses of a necromancer's making, Draugr were often interred with their own ancient burial rites, sometimes even blessed by their own era's priests, and yet they rise anyway, bound by old, dark magic tied to word walls and dragon priests, rather than simple necromantic violation. This suggests that Arkay's law, powerful as it is, was never absolute even in ancient times, and that certain forms of old Nordic magic predate or exist outside the protective framework his priesthood would later establish. Some scholars within the Order of Arkay have speculated that these tombs represent failures of the old rites, burials performed before Arkay's law fully took hold in the north, though this remains contested among his followers rather than settled doctrine. The text known as the Illusion of Death is one of the stranger, more fragmented pieces of Arkay's associated scripture, a cryptic account of the Alessian prophet Maruk's tortured vision of Alessia's spirit, in which he comes to believe that death itself is illusion and that devotion can carry a soul beyond what the text calls the arcane cycle. It's a dense, almost hallucinatory piece of writing, and based on what we know of how the Alessian Order's doctrines later fed into the broader Cyrodiilic pantheon, it's reasonable to infer that this vision of a cycle transcended through devotion helped shape the more accessible, everyday version of Arkay's theology his priesthood would go on to teach. The notion that birth and death aren't opposing forces, but two expressions of the same continuous motion, the same wheel turning. This idea shows up in subtle ways throughout Skyrim's world design, in the way seasons are constantly referenced in dialogue and books, even if they never visibly change on screen, and in the way funerals and births are both treated by NPCs as significant sanctified community events rather than purely private affairs. Arkay's lash, a cactus bearing a bright pink flower prized for its medicinal properties and named directly after the god, further reinforces this cyclical theology. Even in the plant most closely associated with his name, there's a pairing of something that can wound, the cactus's thorns, with something that heals, its medicinal blossom, life and harm bound together in a single living thing. Much as birth and death are bound together in his worshipper's understanding of mortal existence, whatever form his worship takes, from the solemn ritual of a Hall of the Dead to the quiet folk knowledge of an herbalist gathering his sacred flower. Arkay's presence in Tamriel insists that the boundary between living and dying was never meant to be crossed carelessly, only honoured with the patience and respect a cycle that old deserves. Vampirism presents perhaps the single clearest violation of Arkay's law found anywhere in the games, more so even than necromancy, because a vampire doesn't simply disturb the dead. They exist permanently suspended between the two states his entire theology insists must remain distinct. Neither properly alive nor properly passed on, a vampire represents the Arcane cycle, broken at its root. This is likely why the conflict at the heart of the Dawnguard expansion carries such theological weight, even though it's rarely phrased in explicitly religious terms. Isran, the hardened founder of the Dawnguard, pursues vampires with a single-minded intensity that echoes the Vigil of Stendarr's own crusade against Daedra and abominations. And though Isran's order isn't formally tied to Arkay's priesthood, his mission and Arkay's law point toward the same conclusion from different directions, that the line between life and death exists for a reason, and that creatures which straddle it indefinitely represent a wound in the natural order, serious enough to justify open war. Even the choice the game offers you, whether to side with the Dawnguard or embrace vampirism yourself through Serana's bloodline, becomes seen through this lens, a choice about whether Arkay's cycle deserves to be honoured or whether it can be defied. It's worth noting that Arkay's law was never universally embraced, even among cultures nominally loyal to the Nine Divines, and Morrowind offers the clearest example of that friction. Dunmer tradition maintains a practice of ancestor worship built around preserved ancestral tombs, family crypts, where the honoured dead are kept close, venerated, and in some traditions believed capable of offering protection or guidance to their living descendants. This runs directly against the grain of Arkay's insistence that death is a transition meant to be completed, not a state to be lingered in or drawn back toward through ritual attention. Imperial priests of Arkay stationed in Morrowind during the height of Imperial governance, they reportedly viewed Dunmer ancestor tombs with real unease, unable to fully reconcile a religious tradition that kept the dead so deliberately present with their own doctrine's insistence on completed passage. Neither side ever fully converted the other, and the ancestor tombs scattered throughout Morrowind's countryside stand today as a quiet, physical reminder that even a divine as fundamental as Arkay never achieved the kind of uncontested universal acceptance that his priesthood's confidence might suggest. The Blessed Lady Dibella. Dibella, called the Passion Dancer, our Blessed Lady, and sometimes the Queen of Heaven, governs beauty, love, affection, art and music, a sphere that sounds simple on its surface but unfolds into remarkable complexity once you look at how her worship is actually structured across Tamriel. According to the Annuad, the creation myth that many scholars in Cyrodiil treat as foundational scripture, Dibella and the other Aedra were born from the mingled blood of Anu and Padome, which grants them, according to this cosmology, a capacity for both good and evil that the purely Padomaic Daedra largely lack. This detail matters more than it might initially seem, because Dibella's worship throughout the games consistently reflects this duality. She is not a simple goddess of soft, chaste love. Her cults, as old Cyrodiilic texts describe, number nearly a dozen distinct traditions, some devoted to women specifically, some to artists and aesthetic pursuits, and some quite explicitly to what old sources describe as erotic instruction. This range, from spiritual beauty and artistic devotion all the way to sensual worship, is baked into her theology from its oldest recorded texts. The clearest physical expression of this in Skyrim is the Temple of Dibella in Markarth, a striking location built into the upper reaches of that Dwemer-carved city, reached only after climbing a long series of stairs above the shrine of Talos below. Inside, the priestesses, led by a woman named Hamal, maintain a public worship chamber and a more restricted inner sanctum. When you first enter, you're met by a priestess named Senna, who informs you the temple is closed to visitors unless you've participated in a very particular, very memorable drinking contest during an unrelated quest line involving a Daedric prince in disguise. This detail, small as it seems, reflects something true about Dibella's worship more broadly. Access to her deeper mysteries is rarely straightforward, and often tied to moments of vulnerability, celebration, or loss of ordinary control, mirroring the way beauty and passion themselves can arrive unpredictably outside the structures we try to impose on them. The central quest tied to this temple, sometimes called the Heart of Dibella, reveals one of the more fascinating structural elements of her worship: the role of the Sibyl. According to the temple's practice, Dibella herself is said to choose her Sibyl through a process called the Exalted Protocol, a divine revelation delivered to the congregation so that they might find and retrieve the chosen individual. In Markarth specifically, this role has traditionally been filled by a Reach woman selected as a child to spend her entire life in devoted communion with the goddess. When you undertake this quest, you travel to Karthwasten to find the father of a young girl named Fjotra, who has been revealed as the new Sibyl, only to discover she's been captured by a Forsworn and is being held at Broken Tower Redoubt. Rescuing her and returning her to the temple isn't just a fetch quest dressed in temple robes. It's a direct continuation of a religious tradition that ties Dibella's worship to the specific ethnic and cultural identity of the Reach, a detail that speaks to how thoroughly localized and culturally embedded worship of the Nine can become even within a single hold of Skyrim. Dibella's presence extends well beyond her formal temple. Statues and symbols dedicated to her appear scattered throughout Skyrim in places that reveal just how deeply her worship has threaded into everyday life, sometimes in ways that have very little to do with formal religious practice. Helga's bunkhouse in Riften houses a particularly notable statue, tied into the questline of Helga herself, a woman whose relationship with organized worship of Dibella is, to put it gently, unconventional and self-serving. Statues also turn up in Riftweald Manor, in Blackbriar Manor, in the wreckage of ships along the coast, and even inside dungeons controlled by hostile factions, suggesting that reverence, or at least the aesthetic trappings of reverence, for Dibella has spread into corners of Skyrim's culture, far beyond anything the formal Markarth temple would sanction. This scattering of Dibella statues throughout both sacred and profane spaces is a subtle but consistent world-building choice, illustrating a goddess whose domain, beauty and passion resists being contained within a single building, no matter how devoted her priesthood might be. In Cyrodiil, Dibella's worship is even more institutionally prominent. Her house, sometimes called by the archaic name Diblashut, maintains temples across the province, staffed by priests and priestesses. Old texts describe as Epicureans and orgiasts, individuals who aspire toward beauty of both form and mind. Alabaster statuettes depicting her emerging from a ritual bath were produced at the House of Dibella in Anvil, a detail suggesting an established artistic tradition tied directly to her worship, one that treated devotional art not merely as decoration, but as an act of religious practice in its own right. Her temples are also known for keeping small numbers of milk-white cats, sometimes called the Milady's cloud cat, animals considered sacred companions within her houses of worship, a detail that adds a layer of tenderness and domesticity to a goddess whose reputation often skews toward the sensual and dramatic. The celebration of Hearts Day and the related Hearts Week observed during the Second Era gives us another window into how thoroughly Dibella's worship shaped the calendar and public life of cities across the empire. Streets were decorated, celebrations held, and even in rich folk-controlled Markarth, a city with its own distinct religious identity and considerable tension with the imperial authority, the festival was observed. This tells us something important. Even in regions where loyalty to the broader imperial cult was contested or resented, as we'll see much more starkly when we reach Talos later tonight, worship of Dibella specifically tended to transcend those political fractures. Beauty, love, and artistic passion, it seems, proved more universally appealing, or at least less politically dangerous, than reverence for a deified emperor. Her blessing, granted at shrines throughout the games, increases speech skill, a fitting gift from a goddess whose domain includes charm, persuasion, and the artful presentation of oneself to others. When you kneel at her shrine, whether in the grand temple of the divines in solitude, or at a small, forgotten statue tucked away in the wilderness, you're paying tribute to a goddess whose sphere touches nearly every aspect of how mortals experience joy, connection, and self-expression. She stands as proof that the Nine Divines were never meant to be a pantheon of pure abstraction. Dibella's worship, more than almost any other divines, insists that beauty and pleasure are not distractions from the sacred, but expressions of it. It's worth returning briefly to the opening moments of the Knights of the Nine questline in Oblivion, because the very first act of violence that sets the entire storyline in motion is an assault on Dibella's faithful. Umaril, the Unfeathered's return to the mortal realm, begins with the massacre of the priestesses at the chapel of Dibella in Anvil. Their bodies left as a grim message, the chapel itself desecrated with their blood. This detail is easy to treat as simple inciting incident, the spark that sends the player off on a grand quest, but it carries real theological weight once you consider who Umaril actually was. As an Ayleid sorcerer king defeated centuries earlier by Pelinal Whitestrake and the combined might of the divines, Umaril's hatred is aimed squarely at the entire Cyrodiilic pantheon and the mortal race it elevated. Striking first at Dibella's chapel, rather than at Akatosh's grander cathedral or Talos' shrines, one interpretation suggests, reflects a particular cruelty, an attack not on imperial political power, but on beauty and gentleness themselves, an attempt to prove that nothing the divines protect, however seemingly soft or undefended, is safe from his vengeance. The Knights of the Nine, in taking up arms specifically in response to this atrocity, framed their entire crusade as a defense of Dibella's sanctity, as much as a defense of the Empire's religious order more broadly. The cultural friction between Dibella's worship and the harsher, more austere traditions of the Reach also deserves a moment's consideration, since it illuminates something true about how differently the Nine Divines have been received across Skyrim's varied hold cultures. Markarth's population is famously divided between Nords, who settled the ancient Dwemer ruins, and the native Reach folk, whose own religious traditions lean toward the older, wilder worship of Hircine and other spirits. The organized Nine Divines faith would categorize as Daedric. That Dibella's temple sits prominently within Markarth at all, built high above the city and requiring genuine devotion to Reach, speaks to a negotiated coexistence between imperial religious structures and older Reach beliefs, one where the goddess of beauty and passion found more common ground with local tradition than the stricter, more doctrinaire faiths might have. Even the choice of a Reach woman as Sibyl, rather than an outsider imposed from Cyrodiil, suggests Dibella's worship adapted itself to the Reach, rather than simply overwriting what came before, a pattern of accommodation that stands in sharp telling contrast to the far more violent religious history we'll uncover later tonight when we reach the story of Talos. The recurring presence of stolen or displaced Dibella statues throughout Skyrim's side quests, in Riften, in bandit camps, in shipwrecks along the coast, also says something quietly meaningful about how her worship survives even divorced from formal religious context. Degain, the beggar in Markarth who asks you to steal the temple's own statue, and Lisbeth, who has lost a similar statue to bandits and asks for its recovery, both frame the object less as sacred artifact and more as prized possession, valuable enough to steal, valuable enough to mourn losing. This slippage between devotional object and desirable treasure mirrors the broader duality baked into Dibella's theology from the very beginning. A goddess whose worship spans the sacred and the acquisitive, the spiritual and the material, without the games ever treating that overlap as contradiction. Beauty, in her theology, was never meant to be cleanly separated from desire, and the statues scattered so carelessly across Skyrim's dungeons and bedrooms alike are a small physical reminder of just how thoroughly that principle has seeped into the world beyond her temple walls. Dibella's domain over art and music also means her influence quietly touches nearly every bard, playwright, and performer found across Tamriel, whether or not the games ever draw the connection explicitly. The travelling performances of works like The Lusty Argonian Maid, a play whose scandalous reputation follows it from inn to inn across Skyrim, exist within a world where artistic and erotic expression have never been treated as separate categories, requiring separate patron gods. Under a stricter theology, a work like that might be dismissed as vulgar entertainment unworthy of divine attention. But under Dibella's, art that stirs desire and art that stirs aesthetic appreciation both fall under the same sacred umbrella. The Bard's College in Solitude, while not formally a religious institution, trains its students in a craft that exists squarely within her sphere, and it's worth noting that several of the songs performed there, including verses concerning Ragnar the Red and the Ballad of King Olaf, blend history, beauty, and entertainment in exactly the fusion Dibella's worship has always celebrated, rather than kept separate. Even mundane commerce carries a faint imprint of her worship in unexpected corners of Skyrim. Radiant raiment in solitude, the tailoring shop run by the sisters Tari and Endari, exists to sell fine clothing to the province's wealthiest citizens, and the sisters' constant, half-serious bickering over taste and craftsmanship reflects, in miniature, the same devotion to physical beauty and aesthetic presentation that defines Dibella's larger theology. Neither sister would likely describe her work as an act of worship, and the game never suggests they think of it that way themselves, but their insistence that appearance and artistry matter, that how a person presents themselves to the world carries real weight, quietly extends Dibella's domain into an ordinary storefront most players walk past without a second thought. Her worship was never confined to temples and sibyls alone. It survives in every tailor who takes genuine pride in a well-cut coat, every innkeeper who bothers to hang a decent painting, every small, unglamorous insistence that beauty is worth the extra effort, even when no god is watching to reward it. The Wisdom of Julianos. Julianos, the Edric god of wisdom and logic, governs literature, law, history, and, in one of the more curiously specific titles attached to any of the 9, contradiction itself. This last association deserves attention before we go further, because it reveals something genuinely distinctive about how his worship functions compared to the other divines. Where most of the 9 represent a coherent, unified sphere, Julianos' domain explicitly includes the tension between competing truths, the space where logic runs up against paradox and must work through it rather than simply resolve it by decree. His worshippers, largely scholars, wizards, and jurists, don't treat this as a flaw in his portfolio, but as its very point. The pursuit of wisdom, in Julianos' theology, means engaging honestly with contradiction rather than papering over it. His Nordic origin adds an important layer to his story. Julianos is understood to be the successor form of Junal, an older Nordic god associated with language and mathematics, who, according to surviving texts, fell out of favor among the Nords over time and was eventually absorbed into the Cyrodiilic pantheon as Julianos, when Queen Alessia combined aspects of the Aldmeri and Nordic traditions to form her unified religious structure. This absorption pattern echoes what we saw with Arkay, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it demonstrates how the formation of the 9 divines wasn't simply a matter of the Cyrodiilic imperial religion imposing itself on conquered or allied peoples. It was, at least in its founding mythology, a genuine synthesis, taking older, sometimes forgotten gods from multiple cultures and finding them new life within a shared framework. Julianos, born from Junal's near obsolescence, became one of the most consistently respected and intellectually prestigious of the 9 precisely because his synthesis works so well. The most concrete institutional expression of Julianos' worship is the School of Julianos, described in the oldest game text as one of the premier research centers in all of Tamriel, ranked second only to the Mages Guild in scholarly prestige. This detail is worth lingering on, because it establishes something the games rarely state outright but consistently imply. Julianos' temples aren't really temples in the conventional sense of places built primarily for prayer and ritual observance. They function as academies dedicated to literacy, rigorous scholarship, and the maintenance of the Book of Logic, a collection of prayers and philosophical texts maintained by his followers. The school holds what old texts describe as a strict recruitment policy, showing genuine distaste for those who would try to shortcut the long, difficult journey of scholarship, and an active disdain for the power of ignorance, which his followers treat as their true spiritual enemy, far more than any Daedric prince or heretical cult. This scholarly rivalry with the Mages Guild, and by extension with Skyrim's College of Winterhold, which serves as that province's equivalent institution for the magical arts, gives Julianos' worship a fascinating, almost secular dimension that sets him apart from most of the other divines. The College of Winterhold itself, while not formally a religious institution dedicated to Julianos, occupies conceptually similar territory. A place where the pursuit of magical knowledge is treated with a seriousness and rigor that borders on the devotional. Archmage Savos Aren's leadership, the suspicion many ordinary Nords hold toward the college following Winterhold's historical collapse into the sea, and the broader tension between magical learning and popular distrust of wizardry throughout Skyrim, all echo the same dynamic that has always surrounded Julianos' worship. Knowledge and logic, however sacred to those who pursue them, often unsettle those who don't share that devotion. One of Julianos' way shrines in Cyrodiil sits near the Chestnut Handy Stables outside the Imperial City, along the eastern shore of Lake Rumar, and it's actually one of 4 scattered across the province dedicated to him, tied with Akatosh for the most of any divine, a detail worth pausing on given how comparatively modest his public profile seems next to gods like Talos or Mara. This could imply that even though his formal worship concentrated more heavily in dedicated schools than in grand civic ceremony, ordinary travelers and pilgrims still sought his blessing often enough that the wilderness needed more than the usual 3 shrines to accommodate them. His blessing, increasing both magicka and, according to some texts, intelligence, was sought by anyone hoping to sharpen their mind, not merely practicing wizards. The structural weight of his worship may have tilted toward institutions of learning rather than grand civic display, but the sheer number of way shrines suggests his following among common pilgrims was broader than his understated reputation might otherwise suggest. One particularly touching detail concerns the tradition of grateful mentor idols, small carved figures made by followers of Julianos, to honor the teacher who made the greatest impression on them during their education. This practice humanizes Julianos' worship in a way that formal doctrine alone rarely manages. Wisdom, in his theology, isn't simply an abstract virtue to be prayed for. It's something transmitted person to person, teacher to student, across generations, and the god of logic and law is honored not through grand cathedral ceremony, but through small, personal acts of gratitude toward the specific humans who helped a mind grow sharper. When you consider how much of Skyrim's own narrative involves the transmission of ancient knowledge, Greybeard's teaching the voice, Farengar poring over dragon lore in Dragon's Reach, the Psijic Order's careful guardianship of forbidden magical secrets, you can trace a quiet thread of Julianos' influence running beneath nearly every scholarly relationship in the game, whether or not his name is ever explicitly invoked. Julianos governs contradiction not as a weakness to be resolved, but as a permanent feature of a universe built by beings born from 2 opposing primal forces, Anu and Padme. In a pantheon that sometimes seems to promise clean, orderly answers to every mortal question, Julianos stands as a reminder that the pursuit of wisdom rarely arrives at tidy conclusions. It demands the discipline to sit with contradiction, to keep studying even when the answer refuses to resolve cleanly, and to trust that the discipline of logic itself, however incomplete, is worth devoting a lifetime or an eternity to mastering. In Cyrodiil, the primary chapel dedicated to Julianos stands in Skingrad, a city already known throughout the province for its wine and its comparatively refined scholarly culture, which makes it a fitting home for the god of literature and law. This placement, away from the political center of the imperial city, and instead nestled in a smaller, quieter city known for its own cultivated traditions, reflects something of Julianos' character more broadly. His worship rarely seeks the spotlight the way Talos' cult or Akatosh's grand cathedral do. It settles instead into the corners of the empire where careful, patient work is already valued for its own sake. The rivalry between the school of Julianos and the Mages Guild deserves a bit more unpacking too, because it wasn't simply a matter of competing for students or prestige. The two institutions represented, in a sense, two different philosophies of what magical and intellectual pursuit was ultimately for. The Mages Guild, at least in its stated ideals, positioned itself as a resource open to the practical needs of the Empire, training battle mages, enchanters, and alchemists whose skills served immediate, tangible purposes. Julianos' schools, by contrast, treated scholarship as worthwhile independent of its practical application, knowledge and logic pursued because understanding itself was considered sacred, not merely because it produced useful results. That distinction between magic as a tool and magic as a form of devotion to truth echoes through Skyrim's own College of Winterhold, where certain instructors, particularly Tolfdir, with his careful, methodical teaching style, seem to lean instinctively toward the more patient, Julianos-aligned philosophy of learning for its own sake, even without ever invoking his name directly. There's also something worth noting in how Julianos' way shrine blessing, increasing both magicka reserves and, in some traditions, raw intelligence, was treated by pilgrims across Cyrodiil, not merely as a combat convenience, but as a genuine mark of scholarly accomplishment, sought after by students preparing for entrance into the Mages Guild or the College of Whispers, as much as by adventurers hoping for a magical edge before a dangerous dungeon delve. The Book of Logic, the collection of prayers maintained by his priesthood, is described in old sources less as a devotional text in the conventional sense, and more as a living compendium of philosophical inquiry, added to and debated across generations, rather than fixed and unchanging the way a simple book of hymns might be. This distinction matters, because it means Julianos' faith, alone among the nine, treats its own scripture as something meant to be actively argued with, rather than simply recited, a fittingly restless form of worship for a god whose very title includes the word contradiction, and whose followers seem to have decided centuries ago that true reverence for wisdom means never quite letting the conversation close. Ura Groshub, the gruff orc librarian who guards the Arcanium within the College of Winterhold, embodies this same restless devotion to knowledge without ever once invoking Julianos by name, which may be exactly the point. He hoards books, tracks down missing volumes with real ferocity, and treats every scrap of recovered lore as something worth preserving even when its contents are dangerous, forbidden, or simply obscure. That instinct that knowledge itself deserves protection and pursuit, independent of whether it's comfortable or immediately useful, is Julianos' theology made flesh in a character who likely has never set foot inside a formal school of Julianos in his life. The same pattern holds for Septimus Signus, the increasingly unhinged scholar obsessed with the Elder Scrolls and Dwemer secrets, whose descent into madness while chasing understanding reads almost as a cautionary tale about what happens when the pursuit of wisdom Julianos champions is stripped of the discipline and communal grounding his formal schools were meant to provide. Julianos' association with history and literature also finds concrete expression in the sheer volume of dense historical texts scattered as readable books throughout every Elder Scrolls game. Works like the 12-volume account of Tiber Septim's final year of conquest, or the layered multi-perspective chronicles of the Great War that you can find tucked into libraries and manor houses across Skyrim. These aren't quick adventure tales meant to entertain in passing. They're written in the dense, careful, sometimes dry register of genuine historical scholarship, complete with citations, competing accounts, and scholarly disagreement footnoted directly into the text. That the developers chose to fill their world with this specific kind of writing, rather than simplified legend alone, reflects Julianos' theology more than almost any single quest could. A god of literature, law, and history demands exactly this. Sources that argue with each other, historians who disagree, and readers patient enough to sift through contradiction in search of something closer to the truth. The Breath of Kynareth. Kynareth, goddess of air, wind, and sky, occupies one of the most physically pervasive spheres of influence among the nine, because unlike a temple or a shrine, her domain is, quite literally, everywhere above the ground you're standing on. Called Kine by the Nords, Kanathi by the Khajiit, and Tava by the Redguards, she is understood in Nordic tradition as the widow of Shor and the strongest of what old texts call the sky spirits, invoked for auspicious birth stars and general good fortune. In certain legends, she was the first among the spirits to agree to Lorkhan's plan to create the mortal plane, providing the very space within the void where that creation could occur, a detail that positions her alongside Akatosh and Mara as one of the deities present at the very beginning of the world's formation in nearly every major cultural retelling of the creation myth. In Skyrim, the physical center of Kynareth's worship is the Temple of Kynareth in Whiterun, a modest but significant building maintained by the priestess Danica Purespring, located in the city's Wind District, appropriately enough. When the Skyrim civil war intensifies and wounded soldiers from both sides begin flooding into Whiterun, Danica finds herself increasingly overwhelmed, torn between her sacred duties as a priestess and her practical role as one of the few healers capable of tending to the war's casualties. This detail matters because it illustrates something true about Kynareth's worship throughout the games. Her priests are rarely portrayed as isolated mystics removed from worldly concerns. They function as healers first, and the Temple of Kynareth serves the sick and the wounded as readily as it serves pilgrims seeking spiritual blessing. The most significant piece of physical storytelling tied to Kynareth is the Gildergreen, the great tree standing just outside her Whiterun temple, at the heart of the city's central plaza. According to the lore recorded in-game, the Gildergreen was grown from a cutting taken from the Eldergleam, an ancient tree located within a sanctuary cave in Eastmarch, widely believed to be among the oldest living things in all of Tamriel, older than metal, older than the arrival of men and elves upon Nirn. By the time the events of Skyrim's main story unfold, the Gildergreen has recently been struck by lightning and left burned and apparently dead, and the effect on Whiterun's spiritual life is immediate and visible. Pilgrims stop coming. The tree's death feels, to the city's faithful, like a wound in Kynareth's own blessing over the settlement. The quest built around restoring the Gildergreen, sometimes called the Blessings of Nature, offers one of the more quietly profound moral choices tucked into Skyrim's side content. Danica asks you to travel to the Eldergleam Sanctuary and retrieve sap from the mother tree itself, using a weapon called Nettlebane, a blade forged by a coven of hag-ravens specifically for the purpose of harming ancient sacred trees. But along the way, you may encounter Maurice Jondrel, a pilgrim horrified by the notion of harming the elder gleam, even in service of restoring its offspring. He offers an alternative. Pray to the tree directly and request a sapling freely given, rather than one violently extracted. This choice, whether to take by force what the tree might otherwise offer freely, mirrors Kynareth's broader theological identity as a goddess of natural forces that can be harnessed, but should ideally be approached with reverence rather than extraction. The wind can be sailed with or fought against. The ancient tree can be respected or violated. Kynareth's worship, more than perhaps any other divines, insists on the distinction. Kynareth's connection to Kynesgrove, the settlement in East March, whose very name derives from her Nordic identity as Kyne, extends her influence into the geography of Skyrim itself. The woods above Kynesgrove are considered sacred ground, protected traditionally against woodcutting and forestry, a detail that reflects how thoroughly her worship intertwines with practical land stewardship, rather than existing purely as abstract theology. This is also, notably, the location where Alduin is first properly confronted and driven off during the main questline, a coincidence of geography that feels, in the way so much of Skyrim's world-building does, less like coincidence and more like the deliberate layering of significance onto sacred ground. Kynareth's mythological importance extends into the deep history of the Alessian Rebellion as well. She is credited with granting the Lord's Mail to Mori House, the legendary demigod and consort of Saint Alessia, a gift that allowed him to combat the unclean Daedric spirits, threatening the fledgling human rebellion against Ayleid oppression. Kynareth is also suspected, in certain texts, to have communicated with Alessia herself through visions foretelling the arrival of Pelennor Whitestrake, tying her directly into the same founding mythology of the Empire that we'll see running through Akatosh, Arkay, and eventually Talos' stories as well. During the Knights of the Nine questline in Oblivion, one of the Crusaders' relics, specifically the boots granted to Pelennor, required a pilgrim to visit the shrine of Kynareth in the Great Forest and pass a trial set by the goddess herself, in the form of the Forest Guardian, a massive bear sent to test the pilgrim's worthiness. Old Cyrodiilic religious texts note that Kynareth's followers deliberately avoid constructing temples of stone in her honor, believing that a building made of quarried, lifeless material would displease a goddess, whose domain is the living, breathing world of open sky and untamed wilderness. Her blessing, found at shrines across both Cyrodiil and Skyrim, restores health and stamina and, in some versions, grants resistance to poison, gifts appropriate to a goddess whose domain touches the very air mortals breathe and the natural world that sustains them. When you stand outside the Temple of Kynareth in Whiterun and look up at the restored Gildergreen, its branches once again full and blooming, you're looking at more than a piece of environmental set dressing. You're looking at the physical proof of a goddess whose worship insists that the natural world, wind, sky, and root alike, is not merely a resource to be used, but a living relationship to be tended. It's worth pointing out that Kynareth is one of only two divines, alongside Talos in the province's more contested corners, whose worship extends noticeably beyond formal temple walls into the practical working lives of ordinary Skyrim citizens who might never think of themselves as particularly devout. Sailors and dock workers along Solitude's harbour invoke her name for safe passage across open water, a tradition tying directly back to her identity, shared across nearly every Tamrielic culture, as patroness of those who travel beneath open sky. Windhelm, notably, lacks a dedicated Kynareth temple of its own within its icy walls, a curious absence for a city so exposed to her domain of wind and open air, and one that some travellers and scholars have quietly suggested reflects the city's harsher, more insular Nordic character, more inclined toward Talos and Old Shore than toward a goddess whose worship elsewhere emphasizes gentleness and stewardship. The Ring of the Wind, an enchanted artifact from elsewhere said to grant its wearer remarkable speed, is associated by various sources with either Kynareth or Zenithar. A small but telling ambiguity that reflects how thoroughly her domain of open air and swift travel overlaps with the practical concerns of trade and labour that fall more squarely under Zenithar's purview. Yet another reminder that the boundaries between the 9 divine spheres were never drawn as cleanly as a simple list of titles might suggest. There's also a distinctly maternal dimension to Kynareth's mythology that tends to be overshadowed by her more elemental associations with wind and sky. As the mother of Morihaus, the demigod who fought alongside Saint Alessia, and whose lineage, according to some traditions, helped seed the earliest Colovian nobility that would later shape much of Cyrodiil's ruling class. Kynareth's bloodline quietly threads through the founding aristocracy of the empire itself, a detail that sits in interesting tension with her otherwise wild, untamed portrayal as goddess of open sky and unclaimed wilderness. It suggests a deity comfortable existing in 2 registers at once, the fierce, elemental kind invoked by Nord warriors seeking her favour in storm and battle, and the gentler, generative mother figure whose lineage helped seed civilization's earliest ruling houses. Few of the 9 managed to hold both the wild and the civilized within a single coherent identity, as naturally as Kynareth does. And that duality may be exactly why her worship, whether expressed through a sailor's prayer for calm seas or a pilgrim's careful reverence at the roots of the Elder Gleam, has endured so consistently across every era of Tamrielic history. 2 of the ancient words of power scattered across Skyrim's word walls tie directly into her Nordic identity as Kyne, and both are worth knowing if you've ever used them without realizing what you were invoking. Stormcall, learned atop the throat of the world itself, and taught by the Greybeards as one of the most powerful shouts in the game, allows the Dragonborn to summon lightning and blizzards from clear sky, a raw, weaponized expression of Kyne's fury channeled directly through mortal breath. Kyne's peace, by contrast, calms nearby animals and prevents them from turning hostile, a far gentler invocation of the same goddess, one tied to her role as protector of the natural world rather than its stormy avenger. That a single Nordic deity could inspire both a shout capable of leveling a battlefield and one designed purely to soothe wildlife captures something essential about how thoroughly the Nords understood Kyne, not as a goddess of one narrow mood, but as the sky itself, capable of calm mornings and killing storms within the same turning day. Skyrim's coastal holes carry this same reverence in more subtle ways, through the small rituals fishermen and dockhands perform before setting out, and through the old Nordic funeral custom of setting a body adrift on a burning ship, a practice that, whatever else it owes to shore and the ancestors, also entrusts the departed to Kynareth's open sky and water rather than sealing them away entirely underground. This aligns with a broader Nordic instinct that death and travel across open elements are deeply connected, that the sky and sea Kynareth governs form as fitting a passage for the dead as any temple crypt. Solitude's blue palace, perched high above the water with wide balconies open to the wind, was built, according to some accounts, with an eye toward honoring this same openness, its architecture deliberately unwilling to seal its rulers away from the sky the way a more fortified, enclosed palace might. Whether that design choice reflects genuine religious intention or simple practical taste for a scenic view, it fits neatly into the same pattern we've traced throughout Kynareth's worship tonight. A goddess whose faithful have always preferred structures that breathe rather than ones that shut the world out. The Handmaiden's heart. Mara, the mother goddess, goddess of love, occupies a position in Tamrielic religion that's almost paradoxical in its scope. She is, according to nearly every major cultural pantheon across the continent, present in some form, sometimes as wife or concubine to Akatosh or to Lorcan, sometimes, in Nordic tradition, cast in the more diminished role as handmaiden to Kyn and one of Shor's consorts. This near-universal presence across radically different belief systems, human, elven and beyond, marks her, alongside Akatosh and Kynareth, as one of the handful of deities so foundational that virtually no culture in Tamriel manages to worship without some version of her in their pantheon. And yet, despite this cosmic ubiquity, her worship in Skyrim manifests through something intensely, almost domestically personal. Marriage. The Temple of Mara in Riften serves as the central hub for this practice, presided over by the priest Maramal, whom you'll first encounter delivering an impassioned sermon inside the Bee and Barb Tavern before he relocates to the temple proper. His words to prospective couples capture the essential simplicity of Mara's theology as practiced in Skyrim. A person looking for a spouse wears an amulet of Mara openly, signaling their availability, and when another person takes interest and the two agree to a life together, the temple arranges the ceremony. Given how brutal and unpredictable life in Skyrim can be, as Maramal himself notes, courtships tend to be remarkably short, a detail that speaks to a harsh practical wisdom embedded in Mara's worship. Love, in a world under constant threat from dragons, civil war, and worse, doesn't always have the luxury of prolonged, careful courtship. Mara's blessing exists to sanctify commitment quickly, meaningfully, and without excessive ceremony. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals something distinctive about how Mara's worship differs from Dibella's, even though both goddesses touch on love in some form. Where Dibella governs beauty, passion, and artistic devotion, often in ways tied to spectacle and sensuality, Mara's domain is the quieter, more enduring love of partnership, family, and home. The 10 Commands attributed to her instruct the faithful to live soberly and peacefully, to honor their parents, and to preserve the peace and security of home and family, a markedly more domestic and stabilizing set of values than the artistic and sometimes erotic traditions associated with Dibella's houses of worship. Together, the two goddesses form a kind of complementary pair, one governing the spark of passion and beauty, the other governing the enduring bond that can, ideally, grow from it. The quest line tied to the Riften Temple, sometimes called the Book of Love, involves the priestess Dinyabalu, asking you to intervene directly in the romantic affairs of several of Skyrim's citizens, nudging along relationships that circumstance or hesitation have left stalled. This structure, a goddess of love whose temple actively works to engineer romantic outcomes among the mortal population, rather than simply blessing unions that arise organically, positions Mara's priesthood as unusually interventionist compared to most of the other divines. Arkay's priests protect the dead, Kynareth's priests heal the wounded and tend sacred trees. But Mara's priests, at least in Riften, actively matchmake, treating the cultivation of love among mortals as itself a sacred duty rather than something to be left entirely to chance. Mara's connection to Arkay carries a particular poignancy once you know the origin myth we discussed earlier tonight. It was Mara, according to the oldest surviving text on the subject, who offered the dying mortal shopkeeper a choice between death and godhood, ultimately transforming him into Arkay, the god who would go on to preside over the very cycle of birth and death that had nearly claimed the man who prayed to her. Some legends frame this relationship even more intimately, suggesting Mara might have been Arkay's mother in a more literal cosmological sense, rather than simply his benefactor. Either way, the connection threads Mara's compassion directly into the founding myth of one of her fellow divines, establishing her even among gods as a figure whose defining trait is a willingness to intervene mercifully in mortal suffering. Her worship in the Bosmeri pantheon casts her as the wife of Ariel, the elven aspect of Akatosh, further underlining just how thoroughly her figure has been woven into nearly every major cosmology across Tamriel, regardless of how radically those cosmologies otherwise differ from one another. Among the Altmer, a legend tells of Nenamil, the Archon of Song, who undertook a pilgrimage specifically to witness Mara's beauty in person, believing that love for the Mother of Creation represented the greatest love a mortal soul could feel. His journey led him to what became known as Archon's Grove, where he discovered the Rose of Arkon, a flower of surpassing beauty said to have grown in tribute to that devotion. Her blessing, offered at shrines and temples throughout the games, reduces the cost of restoration magic, an appropriately gentle gift from a goddess whose entire theology centers on nurturing, healing, and the sustaining of bonds between people. The amulet of Mara itself, sold by Maramor for a modest sum, carries this same restoration bonus even outside of marriage, meaning that even those who never take a spouse in Skyrim can carry a piece of her blessing with them simply by choosing to wear the symbol of her love openly. When you walk through Riften and see couples strolling near the temple, when you witness a wedding ceremony conducted beneath her statue, you're watching the most intimate expression of any of the 9 divines' worship in the entire game. Not grand cosmic mythology, but 2 people choosing, in a hard and dangerous world, to build a life together under a goddess whose oldest promise is simply this: that love, however brief the window life allows for it, is worth sanctifying. In Cyrodiil, Mara's primary chapel is located in Breville, a city whose reputation across much of the province, fair or not, tends toward the rough and the disreputable, home to smugglers, the Dark Brotherhood's Cheydinhall sanctuary within easy reach, and a general air of neglect compared to the polished streets of the imperial city. That Mara's central place of worship sits in a city so often looked down upon by more prosperous Cyrodiilic settlements feels, one could argue, entirely appropriate to her character. Love and compassion in her theology aren't reserved for the privileged or the respectable. They're offered indiscriminately, extended to a struggling river city as readily as to the gleaming capital, a pattern that echoes her broader reputation across nearly every culture in Tamriel as a goddess who intervenes on behalf of the suffering regardless of their standing. This same compassionate, near-universal accessibility explains why her worship survived so consistently across so many different pantheons, where other divines, Julianos among scholars, Talos among imperial loyalists, found their devotion much more unevenly distributed. Mara asks comparatively little of her worshippers beyond sincerity, and in a world as harsh and unpredictable as Tamriel, that low barrier to her mercy may be precisely why her name endures in nearly every corner of the continent, whispered by the desperate and the hopeful alike. Eranda, the priest you meet during the Waking Nightmare questline in Dawnsar, offers one of the most affecting examples of Mara's compassion extended to someone who, by most measures, would seem to have forfeited any right to it. Once known as Brother Casimir, he served the Daedric Prince Vermina and helped unleash the miasma that plagued Dawnstar for years, tormenting its citizens with unending nightmares. His path toward redemption led him to Mara's temple, and if you spare him at the end of that quest and escort him safely to Riften, he tells you, with quiet and genuine gratitude, that he has always wanted to make a pilgrimage to the Temple of Mara, thanking you for finally making that possible. It's a small moment, easy to miss if you're not paying attention, but it captures something essential about how her worship functions differently from Arkay's or Stendarr's more procedural doctrinal approaches to redemption and justice. Mara doesn't ask Erendor to prove himself through ritual or penance before extending her mercy. She simply exists as a destination worth walking toward, a symbol that even someone who spent years serving a Daedric Prince of Nightmares can still choose in the end to walk toward love instead. The Mercy of Stendarr. Stendarr, called Stendarr the Steadfast, holds one of the more layered titles among the 9. God of mercy, charity, well-earned luck, and justice, sometimes further described as the god of righteous might and merciful forbearance. That pairing, mercy and might, held together, rather than in opposition, defines nearly everything about how his worship has evolved and how it manifests in the games. His origins trace back to an older Nordic figure named Stun, god of ransom and shield thane to shore, a warrior deity whose worship gradually transformed over centuries into the gentler, more compassion-centered figure recognized within the 9 divines. Even in early Altmeri legend, he's referred to as the apologist of men, a title suggesting that even among cultures inclined to look down on humanity, Stendarr represented a voice arguing for mortal mankind's worth and dignity. Stendarr's worship carries strong institutional weight throughout the Empire. He is the patron of the Imperial Legion specifically, invoked by soldiers, magistrates and rulers seeking the strength to govern and fight justly, rather than merely effectively. He's said to have accompanied Tiber Septim in his later years, a detail that quietly links Stendarr's mythology to the very founding of the Third Empire and, by extension, to the events that would eventually lead to Talos's own apotheosis, a connection we'll examine much more closely later tonight. This martial dimension of his worship coexists, sometimes uneasily, with his equally strong association with compassion, healing, and protection of the vulnerable, creating a theological identity that asks its followers to hold both righteous strength and merciful restraint simultaneously, refusing to let either virtue collapse into the other's absence. In Skyrim, Stendarr's most visible institutional presence comes through the Vigil of Stendarr, a religious order of priests and warriors headquartered at the Hall of the Vigilant, led during the game's early events by Keeper Karset. The Vigilants describe their mission in stark, uncompromising terms when you encounter them along Skyrim's roads. They exist to combat the threat of Daedra wherever it appears, alongside vampires, werewolves, and what they term other abominations that prey on the innocent. Their standard greeting to travelers, offering Stendarr's mercy while noting the vigil has none left to spare, captures something genuinely poignant about how their order has been shaped by their unending struggle. They frame their violence explicitly as compassion turned outward, cleansing threats to protect mortal lives, even as their methods, hunting werewolves and vampires with equal ruthlessness, regardless of individual circumstance, raise uncomfortable questions about how mercy and righteous might can shade into something closer to zealotry when practiced without careful restraint. The tragic fate of the Hall of the Vigilant itself deserves mention here, because it represents one of Skyrim's more quietly devastating pieces of environmental and narrative storytelling. Depending on when a player encounters Keeper Karset, the Hall is fated to be destroyed by vampire forces relatively early in the game's broader timeline. If the Dawnguard content is active, an event that essentially wipes out an entire branch of Stendarr's most dedicated militant worshippers in a single, largely unwitnessed catastrophe. The dramatic irony embedded in any conversation with Karset before this event occurs, her confidence and dedication to protecting the faithful, set against a fate she cannot foresee, illustrates something genuinely sobering about Stendarr's theology as it plays out in the actual world of the game. Righteous might, however sincerely wielded, doesn't guarantee protection. The Vigil's near-total destruction stands as a reminder that devotion to a god of mercy and justice offers no immunity from the world's cruelty, only the conviction to keep fighting against it regardless. Stendarr's artifacts carry this same duality of gentleness and force. Stendarr's hammer, an ebony and sapphire weapon rumored to have once been wielded by the god himself, is fittingly heavy, an appropriate instrument for a deity whose title includes righteous might, even as its enchantment drains the health of those it strikes at the cost of the wielder's own stamina. A mechanical detail that echoes the idea that righteous force always demands something of the one who wields it. The Ring of Stendarr's Mercy, tied historically to the protection of the Amulet of Kings and the sacred site of Sancre Tor, connects his worship directly back into the same lineage of imperial legitimacy we trace through Akatosh's covenant with Alessia's bloodline. Another thread showing how thoroughly interwoven the mythologies of the Nine truly are, even when their individual spheres seem, on the surface, distinct from one another. His symbol, described in various sources as a grail pouring forth what's sometimes called the lifeblood of justice, captures this same dual imagery, sustenance and judgment poured from the same sacred vessel. In Cyrodiil, before the Vigil's more militant expression took hold in Skyrim, worship of Stendarr tended to center more heavily on his role as comfort for the law-abiding citizen and inspiration for magistrates and rulers seeking to govern fairly. The Second-Era organization known as the Resolutes of Stendarr represents an earlier, related expression of this same devotional impulse. Warriors and priests dedicated to defending the vulnerable, a lineage that the Vigil of Stendarr would later inherit, and, in Skyrim's harsher climate of dragons, civil war, and resurgent Daedric threats, sharpen into something considerably more militant and unforgiving. His blessing, found at shrines across the games, typically boosts one-handed weapon damage against undead, or in other iterations, provides broader protective effects, gifts appropriate to a god whose worship exists precisely at the intersection of protective violence and merciful intention. When you encounter a Vigilant of Stendarr on a lonely Skyrim road, weathered, armed, and utterly convinced of their righteous purpose, you're meeting the living inheritance of a god whose oldest command to his followers reads simply, "Be kind and generous to the people of Tamriel, protect the weak, heal the sick, and give to the needy." Whether the Vigil's harsh methods still honor that founding gentleness, or whether centuries of fighting monsters has hardened Stendarr's mercy into something closer to zealotry, is a question the games leave pointedly, deliberately unresolved. This same tension surfaces sharply in Skyrim's Companion's questline, an organization built substantially around lycanthropy, the very affliction the Vigil considers an abomination worthy of destruction without exception or mercy. When you undertake the companion's storyline and eventually gain the choice of whether to embrace or cure your own beast blood, you're standing, whether the game frames it this way explicitly or not, on the precise fault line of Stendarr's contested theology. Is a werewolf transformed against their will, or embracing the change willingly for strength in battle, still deserving of the mercy his doctrine promises to the weak and suffering? Or have they, in the Vigil's uncompromising reading of his law, forfeited that protection entirely the moment the curse took hold? The game never has the Vigil and the companions directly clash in any major scripted confrontation, but the ideological distance between them says a great deal about how differently Stendarr's core promise, righteous might tempered by merciful forbearance, can be interpreted depending on who's doing the interpreting. In the earlier era of the Second Empire, the resolutes of Stendarr who preceded the Vigil are remembered somewhat more gently in surviving texts, framed primarily as protectors of the vulnerable rather than hunters of the cursed, which suggests that the harder, more absolutist edge that defines the Vigil by the time you meet them in Skyrim may itself be a product of the desperate, monster-haunted era they were born into rather than an inevitable expression of Stendarr's will. Mercy, it seems, is not immune to being worn down by centuries of war against darkness, even among those who serve a god whose very name is meant to embody it. One of the more unsettling threads tying the Vigil to Skyrim's Daedric quests plays out in Markarth, where a vigilant named Tyrannus approaches you outside an abandoned house, convinced that Daedra worship is taking place inside and asking for help investigating. He's very much alive at this point, earnest and committed to his order's purpose, and if you agree to help him, the two of you descend together into what turns out to be a shrine of Molag Bal. What happens next complicates any easy reading of the Vigil as simply heroic. The quest ultimately forces a confrontation in which Tyrannus must be killed before the artifact can be claimed. A grim requirement of Molag Bal's own influence over the site, rather than any failure of the Vigilant's courage. A man who walked in seeking to protect Markarth from Daedric corruption becomes, one way or another, a casualty of that same corruption before the encounter is through. It's a small, uncomfortable illustration of how thoroughly stacked the odds are against the Vigil's mission. They go looking for danger deliberately, and Skyrim rarely lets that kind of courage go unpunished. The deified emperor, Talos. No figure among the nine divines carries more political weight, more open controversy, or more direct bearing on the world you actually walk through in Skyrim than Talos. Unlike the other 8, whose divinity stretches back to the earliest moments of creation, Talos was, for most of his existence, an entirely mortal man. Tiber Septim, the human who accomplished what no one before him had managed, uniting all the nations of Tamriel under a single empire. His life as a mortal is, according to nearly every scholarly source, shrouded in legend and hearsay, layered over with myth, to the point where separating the historical man from the god he would become is, at this distance, essentially impossible. But one feat remains undisputed across every source. His conquest and unification of the continent was so total, so consequential, that upon his death, his deeds were judged sufficient for apotheosis, his elevation into the ranks of the gods themselves, transforming the 8 divines that Alessia had established centuries earlier into the 9. This origin alone, a mortal man ascending to sit alongside gods who had existed since the dawn of creation, makes Talos theologically unique and, to certain factions across Tamriel, deeply offensive. the Aldmeri Dominion, and specifically the Thalmor who govern it, hold as a foundational tenet of their supremacist ideology that a mere man could not possibly achieve true apotheosis, that his worship represents at best a category error and at worst a dangerous heresy that elevates mortal, specifically human, ambition to a status that Thalmor believe only the Mer bloodline could ever rightfully claim. This isn't a minor theological quibble confined to academic debate. It became, in the aftermath of the Great War between the Third Empire and the Third Aldmeri Dominion, one of the central, non-negotiable demands the Thalmor placed upon the defeated empire. The Great War itself, fought from 4 E171 to 175, ended in a punishing imperial defeat, culminating in the temporary capture of the imperial city before its recapture, and finally the signing of the White Gold Concordat, the treaty that ended the war on terms overwhelmingly favourable to the Dominion. According to nearly every account of the negotiations, the Thalmor's original demands, tribute, the disbandment of the Blades, the banning of Talos worship, and the cession of large sections of Hammerfell, were essentially the same demands they had made before the war even began, meaning the Empire fought and lost a devastating war, only to end up conceding almost precisely what the Thalmor had originally asked for. Emperor Titus Mede II signed the treaty because, according to virtually every historical source, continuing the war would very likely have resulted in total imperial collapse rather than mere defeat. The White Gold Concordat, in other words, wasn't a negotiated peace between equals. It was survival purchased at the cost of the Empire's spiritual and military independence. The specific ban on Talos worship, embedded directly into the treaty's terms, is worth dwelling on because of how it reshaped the daily religious life of ordinary people across the Empire, and especially in Skyrim, where reverence for Talos ran deepest, given his origins as a figure closely tied to Nordic history and identity. Initially, this ban was enforced only loosely. The Empire, still reeling from the war and desperate to avoid further conflict, largely turned a blind eye to continued Talos worship, particularly in Skyrim, where shrines to him remain standing and largely undisturbed. This changed dramatically following what's known as the Markarth incident. During the chaos of the Great War's aftermath, the Reachmen had seized control of Markarth and declared independence, hoping eventually to rejoin the Empire as a recognized province in their own right. Ulfric Stormcloak led a Nord militia to crush this uprising and restore Markarth to imperial control. But as compensation for his aid, he demanded that the Jarl of the Reach formally repeal the local ban on Talos worship, a demand the Jarl, under pressure, granted. This act, seemingly a local political concession, triggered consequences that reshaped the entire province. The Thalmor, discovering that Talos worship had been officially sanctioned again in defiance of the Concordat's terms, viewed this as proof the Empire could not or would not enforce the treaty it had signed, and used the incident as justification to demand far greater enforcement powers within Skyrim itself. This is the origin of the Thalmor embassy overlooking Solitude, and the network of justiciars who, by the time you begin Skyrim's main questline in 4E201, patrol the province actively hunting down evidence of continued Talos worship, empowered to interrogate, detain, and in practice frequently to torture and execute anyone suspected of defying the ban. The persecution grew severe enough, and the resentment it generated deep enough, that it became one of the primary catalysts for the Stormcloak Rebellion itself, the civil war that forms the entire political backdrop of the game you're playing when you first step off the cart at Helgen. It's worth being precise about what the Talos ban actually represents within this conflict, because the game deliberately resists offering a simple, one-sided morality play. Ulfric Stormcloak's cause is built substantially around the demand for the freedom to worship Talos openly, and Nords across Skyrim, whatever their opinion of Ulfric personally, or the broader question of Skyrim's independence from the Empire, tend to share a genuine, deeply felt grievance about a foreign power dictating which of their own gods they're permitted to pray to. At the same time, the Empire's own position, reluctantly enforcing a ban it never wanted, is framed with real sympathy in the game's writing. General Tullius and Imperial loyalists argue, with considerable historical justification, that a fractured, internally warring Skyrim only strengthens the Thalmor's ultimate position, and that reigniting full-scale war with the Dominion over the specific issue of Talos worship risks a second Great War the Empire is in no condition to survive. Neither side is simply right or simply wrong. The Talos ban functions less as a plot device and more as a genuinely difficult political and spiritual dilemma, exactly the kind of unresolved historical wound that tends to produce civil wars in the real world as well. Talos' worship persists throughout Skyrim in ways both open and hidden, and walking through the province with this history in mind changes how you see nearly every shrine you encounter. In Solitude, the shrine of Talos was formally removed from the city's Temple of the Divines in compliance with the Concordat. A visible, physical erasure of his presence from the seat of imperial power in Skyrim, though it can be restored if Stormcloak forces take the city. In Whiterun, Riften and Windhelm, priests of Talos openly supported Ulfric's cause, even while the ban remained technically in effect elsewhere, demonstrating just how unevenly and contentiously the Concordat's terms were actually observed on the ground. Heimskr, the street preacher shouting sermons in Whiterun streets throughout the entire game, represents this defiance made loud and public. A former respected scholar whose research convinced him that Talos worship carried genuine theological necessity, and whose increasingly desperate, unhinged public preaching reflects years of being ignored, mocked, and marginalized for a belief he refuses to abandon regardless of the political cost. The Thalmor's ideological justification for the ban deserves careful attention as well, because it reveals something important about how the games portray institutional persecution generally. The Thalmor don't frame the ban purely as a punitive measure or a simple exercise of conqueror's power, though it functions as both. Their doctrine holds that Talos worship represents a genuine metaphysical error, a category confusion in which mortal men mistake the achievements of an extraordinarily successful conqueror for actual divine transformation. Some Thalmor agents, like Ondolemar, the Justicia stationed in Markarth, appear to hold this belief with what reads as genuine, if deeply misguided conviction, framing their persecution of Talos worshippers not as cruelty, but as a kind of theological correction, saving misguided Nords from what they see as a corrupting, false faith. This doesn't excuse the campaign of surveillance, imprisonment, and violence the Thalmor conduct throughout Skyrim, but it does complicate the picture in ways that resist easy villain and victim storytelling, illustrating how genuinely held ideology, not merely cynical political calculation, can produce some of history's most devastating campaigns of religious suppression. Talos' own theology, separate from the political controversy surrounding his worship, positions him as the protector and patron of just rulership and civil order, the hero god of mankind specifically, worshipped under names including Ysmir and the heir to the seat of sundered kings in various Nordic traditions that predate and continue alongside his formal identity as one of the Nine. His connection to the dragonborn identity you carry throughout Skyrim's main questline isn't incidental. Tiber Septim himself was said to possess the voice, the same power of Thu'um that defines your character's abilities throughout the game, tying his mortal accomplishments directly to the same ancient Nordic tradition of dragonborn heroes that Alduin's rise threatens to unravel. In this sense, worship of Talos in Skyrim carries a double resonance for the player character specifically, a controversial, politically fraught religious practice, and a mythological lineage the Dragonborn quite literally shares. If the Stormcloaks succeed in winning Skyrim's civil war, Talos worship is restored to legal status throughout the province, a resolution that, whatever else it settles, does nothing to resolve the underlying question the Thalmor's ideology poses, whether a mortal man can rightfully become a god, and whether the political and religious autonomy of a conquered people should ever be subject to negotiation by an empire that itself was once conquered and forced into concessions it never wanted to make. The White Gold Concordat remains, as of the events you're living through in Skyrim, unresolved and unrenegotiated, a treaty born of desperate survival rather than justice. And Talos's worship stands as perhaps the single clearest example in the entire Elder Scrolls universe of how theology, politics, war, and personal faith can become so thoroughly entangled that no clean separation between them remains possible. It's worth dwelling for a moment on just how many names Talos carries, because each one reflects a different facet of the same contested identity. As Tiber Septim, he is remembered as the mortal conqueror and statesman. As Ysmir, Dragon of the North, he's claimed by Nordic tradition as one of their own, a title suggesting the old Nordic pantheon absorbed him as readily as Cyrodiil did, perhaps even more readily, given how central his legend remains to Nordic identity centuries after his ascension. As the heir to the seat of Sundered Kings, his legacy ties directly into the ancient, fractured line of Skyrim's own royal succession, a detail that positions him not as an outside conqueror imposing imperial rule on the Nords, but as a figure who, in some tellings, fulfilled a distinctly Nordic destiny by uniting a throne long since sundered. This layering of identities, Imperial Emperor, Nordic dragon hero, ascended god, means that when the Thalmor moved to ban his worship, they weren't simply suppressing one deity among 9. They were, from the perspective of many Nords, attacking a figure who belonged to their own bloodline and their own ancient prophecy as much as to the Empire's official pantheon, which helps explain why the resentment the ban generated in Skyrim specifically ran so much deeper and burned so much hotter than it did in provinces with less direct, less ancestral acclaim to his legend. It's worth noting that Talos's godhood is a comparatively recent development on the grand timescale of Tamrielic religion. The events of the Elder Scrolls Online take place nearly a millennium before Skyrim, roughly 950 years by most reckonings, well before Tiber Septim was even born, which means the pantheon worshipped throughout that earlier era is genuinely the 8 divines, full stop, with no controversy attached because there was, quite simply, no Talos yet to be controversial about. Characters and storylines set in that period reference Tiber Septim's eventual rise only as distant, half-legendary prophecy, if at all. This detail helps put the entire 4th era controversy in perspective. Worship of Talos isn't some ancient, foundational pillar of Tamrielic faith, stretching back to the beginning of the world, the way reverence for Akatosh or Mara does. It's a relatively young addition to the pantheon, born from a single, spectacularly successful mortal life, which makes the Thalmor's argument that his apotheosis was illegitimate, at least understandable, as a position even for those who'd never side with the methods used to enforce it. A god who ascended within recorded, documented history invites exactly the kind of scrutiny that gods born at the dawn of creation never have to face. The imperial cult's own internal literature reflects just how uncomfortable this whole controversy made even the empire's own religious institutions. A propaganda text known as the Talos Mistake, authored by a writer named Leonora Venatus, was produced and circulated specifically to encourage acceptance of the ban, arguing, in essence, that the loss of Talos worship was a survivable, even reasonable concession for the greater good of imperial survival. That such a text needed to be written and distributed at all tells you everything about how unpersuaded much of the population remained. Ordinary Nords didn't need a pamphlet to explain away the disappearance of the divine hero whose deeds their grandparents had sung about for generations, and the very existence of state-sponsored literature trying to talk them into acceptance reveals an empire keenly aware that its own compliance with the Concordat was at best an uneasy and deeply unpopular necessity, rather than a position it held with genuine conviction. Some ordinator edicts from the era even referred to a set of religious heresies as the 8 apostasies, a phrasing many scholars believe was a direct, if somewhat euphemistic, reference to continued Talos worship itself. Heresy defined not by any true theological error, but by simple political inconvenience to the treaty's terms. It's also worth sitting with just how strange the entire situation would have felt to someone living through it without the benefit of hindsight. For the vast majority of the Third Era, worship of Talos as one of the 9 wasn't controversial in the slightest. It was simply orthodoxy, the natural, uncontested culmination of Alessia's original 8 becoming 9 upon the ascension of the man who unified the entire continent under a single banner. The ban didn't emerge from any internal theological crisis or gradual erosion of belief. It was imposed suddenly, entirely from outside, by a foreign power that had just finished losing an ideological war of its own making, and then somehow negotiated its way into dictating the internal religious life of the empire it had failed to fully conquer. This is part of why the wound cuts so deep throughout Skyrim's narrative. It isn't a slow fading of an old god from cultural relevance, the kind of quiet obsolescence that swallowed Junal before he became Julianos. It's an act of imposed erasure, backed by military occupation and active persecution, against a faith that remained, right up until the moment of the ban, the living, thriving center of imperial religious identity. The player's own position within this conflict deserves one final consideration, because Skyrim rarely forces you to resolve it, only to live inside it. Whether you side with Ulfric's Stormcloaks or General Tullius's Legion, whether you kneel at a hidden shrine of Talos in defiance of Thalmor law, or avoid the subject entirely, the game tracks none of this as belonging to a single righteous path. Even Imperial-aligned playthroughs still allow you to worship Talos privately, still let you receive his blessing at shrines scattered through the wilderness, far from Thalmor patrols. A detail that quietly acknowledges what the political conflict cannot fully resolve. That faith in Talos for the ordinary people of Skyrim was never really about which army wins a civil war. It persists in backrooms, in wayside shrines, in the private prayers of people who have simply refused, treaty or no treaty, to stop believing that a mortal man once achieved something worthy of a god's name. The provider's ease, Zenithar. We close tonight's journey with Zenithar, the god of work and commerce, sometimes called the provider of our ease, whose sphere might initially seem the least dramatic of the 9, but which, on closer inspection, governs something every single mortal in Tamriel depends on regardless of their station. Honest labour and the systems of trade that let a society actually function day to day. Zenithar is frequently understood as the same deity worshipped by the Bosmer and Breton peoples under the name Zen, though within the imperial pantheon specifically, he's regarded as a somewhat more cultivated god, associated less with rough labour alone and more with the merchant class, and lower nobility who built their fortunes and social standing through trade, rather than inherited title or martial conquest. His doctrine, preserved in the old Ten Commands text, is refreshingly direct compared to the more layered, sometimes contradictory theology of gods like Julianos or Stendarr. Zenithar says simply, "Work hard, and you will be rewarded. Spend wisely, and you will be comfortable. Never steal, or you'll be punished." There's an almost blunt practical morality embedded in this doctrine that sets Zenithar apart from the loftier cosmic concerns of gods like Akatosh, or the politically fraught controversy surrounding Talos. His faith isn't concerned with the fate of empires or the nature of time itself. It's concerned with whether an honest craftsman gets paid fairly for their labor, whether a merchant deals truthfully with their customers, and whether the basic social contract of work and reward holds together at the level of ordinary daily life. Temples dedicated to Zenithar carry a name that reflects this no-nonsense theological character. They're called resolutions rather than temples or chapels, a linguistic choice old sources describe as more fitting for a movement built to be adaptable yet resilient against the storm of time, much like the commerce it presides over. Within a resolution of Zenithar, worship takes a distinctly transactional, almost business-like form compared to the ritual observances found in temples of other divines. Followers can pay into the resolution to receive a temporary boost to their haggling and mercantile skill, or join more formally to train under experienced merchants and receive permanent instruction in the arts of trade. This structure, worship expressed through commerce itself rather than separate from it, perfectly embodies Zenithar's theology. For his followers, honest work and fair trade aren't activities that exist alongside faith. They are the faith practiced daily in every transaction, conducted with integrity. In Skyrim specifically, Zenithar's most visible presence comes not through a grand central temple, since unlike Kynareth, Mara, or Dibella, he has no single dedicated building of major significance within the province, but through modest shrines scattered across the wilderness and a shrine maintained within the temple of the divines in solitude. His shrines are, fittingly, shaped like anvils, a symbol that ties his worship directly to the labor of craftsmen, blacksmiths, and artisans whose daily work embodies his doctrine most literally. Travelers making their way through the more remote stretches of Skyrim's holds can stumble across these small wayside anvil shrines tucked into the wilderness, easy to miss, offering no grand pilgrimage or ceremony, just a quiet place for a merchant or labourer passing through to pause and ask for fair fortune in the trade ahead. The character of Gorza Grabagol, the orc blacksmith found in Markarth's Warrens, offers a particularly grounded illustration of Zenithar's worship and practice, even without explicit religious dialogue attached to her. Her dedication to her craft, her insistence on quality work despite the harsh circumstances of her life in the Reach, and her position as a small business owner navigating a difficult economic environment all reflect, whether the game states it outright or not, the lived values Zenithar's doctrine promotes. Work hard, and you will be rewarded, even when that reward comes slowly and against considerable resistance. This same pattern echoes through other craftsmen across Skyrim, Balamund in Riften, whose refusal to compromise on the quality of his forged weapons despite the financial hardship it causes him, embodies almost precisely the tension Zenithar's theology creates between honest labor and worldly reward, a tension the god's own doctrine acknowledges without ever promising it will resolve easily or quickly. Zenithar's association with a blue star that occasionally shines over Tamriel adds a small mystical dimension to an otherwise thoroughly practical deity, and his connection to Kynareth is noted in several older texts as particularly close, since Zenithar's craftsmen and traders necessarily depend on the raw materials Kynareth's natural world provides. This linkage suggests that even the most economically minded of the 9 divines cannot be worshipped in true isolation from the natural forces that make commerce possible in the first place, or mined from earth. Kynareth governs, timber harvested from forests under her protection, wool and hide taken from animals living beneath her open sky. One cannot, according to this theological logic, worship Zenithar without implicitly acknowledging Kynareth's power as well. A quiet reminder that the 9 divines, however distinct their individual spheres, were never meant to function as 9 separate, competing faiths, but as interconnected facets of a single, coherent religious tradition. The gift of Pelinal's mace, one of the original relics of the Crusader granted by the 8 divines to the legendary warrior during the Alessian slave rebellion, came specifically from Zenithar, and upon Pelinal's death, that mace was said to have been carried by messenger to Leowyn, a detail linking Zenithar's worship directly into the same founding mythology of the Empire that runs through so many of the 9 we've discussed tonight. Even a god whose worship centers on the unglamorous rhythms of daily labor and honest trade has his place in the grand founding legends of Tamriel's civilization. A reminder that empires are built not only by generals and deified emperors, but by the countless ordinary laborers, merchants, and craftsmen whose steady, unglamorous work Zenithar has always claimed as sacred. There's a quieter irony worth sitting with when it comes to Zenithar's presence in Riften specifically, a city whose entire economy, on the surface at least, runs on trade and craft in exactly the way his doctrine would seem to bless, and yet whose underlying economy is dominated by Maven Blackbriar's criminal empire and the Thieves' Guild, operating out of the Ratway beneath the streets. Zenithar's command against theft sits in direct, constant tension with a city where an enormous share of the actual commerce flows through fenced goods, smuggled skooma, and coin extorted under threat. Honest merchants like Bercy Honeyhand at the Pawned Prawn struggle to keep their shops solvent, while operations built on theft and extortion flourish openly under the protection of a corrupt steward and an indifferent Jarl. If Zenithar's theology holds that honest work leads to just reward, Riften stands as one of the more pointed counterexamples in the entire game. A place where his doctrine is preached, at least implicitly, far more often than it's actually practiced, and where the god of fair commerce would, one imagines, find remarkably little to bless. Compare that to Riverwood, a far humbler settlement built almost entirely around the honest labor Zenithar's doctrine celebrates. The Riverwood trader, run by Lucan Valarius and his sister Camilla, survives on the modest, steady business of a small logging town, and the entire opening stretch of the main quest line hinges on a straightforward act of restorative justice, recovering Lucan's stolen golden claw from bandits who took it through force rather than trade. There's no grand political stakes attached to that early quest, no civil war or ancient prophecy, just a shopkeeper who did honest work and had something taken from him unfairly, and a player character who can choose to set that small injustice right. It's easy to forget 3 hours into Skyrim, once dragons and greybeards and the fate of the world have taken over the narrative, that the game's very first extended quest is built on precisely the values Zenithar's doctrine holds sacred. Work hard, and you deserve to keep what that work earned you. His blessing, granted at shrines throughout the games, improves prices when buying and selling from merchants. A wonderfully literal expression of a god whose entire theology concerns fair, prosperous trade. When you kneel before an anvil-shaped shrine somewhere in the wilds of Skyrim, or negotiate a better price with a merchant after receiving his blessing, you're participating in perhaps the most quietly universal religious practice among all the 9 divines, one that requires no grand pilgrimage, no cosmic understanding of creation myths or civil wars, only the simple daily discipline of honest work, fair dealing, and the patience to trust that diligence, however unglamorous, is itself a form of devotion worth honouring. There's one final thread worth pulling before we let the fire burn low tonight, a thread that connects all 9 of these gods back to the single founding moment that made their shared pantheon possible in the first place. When Saint Alessia stood at the head of her rebellion against the Aelids, she inherited 2 separate religious traditions, one Aldmeri in character, absorbed by her people during generations of captivity, and one Nordic, carried south by the armies from Skyrim who fought alongside her. Rather than forcing one tradition to erase the other, she wove them together, finding in Akatosh and Ariel, in Kynareth and Kyne, in Julianos and Junal, enough common ground to build something new without demanding either culture abandon what it already believed. That founding act of synthesis, imperfect and, as we've seen especially in Talos' story, sometimes fractured under the weight of later politics, remains the quiet miracle sitting beneath every shrine we've discussed tonight. The 9 divines were never handed down complete and unchanging from the dawn of creation. They were built, negotiated, and continually renegotiated by mortals trying to find shared language for the sacred amid war, conquest, and centuries of change, which may be the truest thing anyone could say about faith in Tamriel at all. Think, too, of how differently each of these 9 gods asks to be approached. Akatosh through obedience and continuity, Arkay through ritual and respect for the boundary between life and death, Dibella through beauty offered and received without shame, Julianos through patient, sometimes contradictory study, Kynareth through stewardship of wind, root, and open sky, Mara through the quiet, deliberate choice to love someone in a dangerous world, Stendarr through the difficult balance of strength and mercy, Talos through a controversy that refuses, even now, to resolve itself cleanly, and Zenithar through the unglamorous discipline of honest work, day after day, with no promise that the reward will ever feel proportionate to the effort. No single one of these approaches to the sacred is presented as more correct than the others. Tamriel's faith, taken as a whole, seems to insist that a world this large and this old needs more than one way to be devout. And that, cozy nights, brings us to the end of tonight's journey through the 9. 9 gods, 9 spheres of influence, and 9 different ways mortals across Tamriel have found to make sense of a world shaped by time, death, beauty, wisdom, wind, love, mercy, ambition, and honest labor. From the dragonfires beneath the imperial city to the quiet shrine tucked behind a rock outside Markarth, From the wedding bells of Riften's temple to the desperate defiance of a street preacher in Whiterun, still shouting Talos' name against an empire too afraid to stop him. The Nine Divines have never been a distant, abstract theology floating somewhere above the world. They are woven into every shrine you've passed without stopping, every prayer murmured by an NPC you barely noticed, every quiet act of devotion carried out by people trying, in their own small ways, to live rightly beneath gods who are, in the end, as complicated, as contradictory, and as human as the mortals who worship them. Sleep well, cozy nights.